So about 5 years ago, my brother sent my other brothers and I an email asking if we knew what our cholesterol was at. And the reason he wanted to know is because when he received his blood work, his cholesterol had gone up to 230. And so he was just asking because he was wondering if it was hereditary, if it ran in the family, was it genetics? And so I sent him an email back and I told him, I said, there's no way that it's genetic. Even if your other brothers have high cholesterol, there's something going on in your life that's causing your cholesterol to go up. And if you want to have any, if you want me to answer any questions around that, just let me know. And so I didn't hear anything from him. You know, I probably wouldn't want to take advice from my brother either. But a year had gone by, and all of a sudden he calls me up. He says, Dan, I have some questions around my cholesterol. I said, all right, what's going on? He said, well, I had my blood work done again. So I had my annual physical this year, and now my cholesterol is 270. And that's really high. And so he said, what do you think might be causing it? And again, he started thinking it was genetic or it was hereditary. And so I told him, I said, there's a few factors that play a role into your cholesterol. One of those factors is stress. If you're under a lot of stress, your body's going to release stress hormones. Those stress hormones, like adrenaline and cortisol, require LDL for the production of that cholesterol or for the stress hormones. And so as our body releases more stress hormones, the liver ramps up the production of LDL or the bad cholesterol to produce more stress hormones. I said it can also be lack of exercise. I said those that exercise on a regular basis, and specifically aerobically exercise, meaning you're increasing your heart rate, you're increasing your respiration rate, and you're sweating. Those that exercise on a regular basis have lower cholesterol. Every bit of research shows that. And then finally, it's the food that we eat. And if we're eating foods that are high inflammatory foods, in other words, they're foods that cause a lot of inflammation in our body, we're going to start to increase our cholesterol levels because cholesterol patches the damage done to the cell wall of the blood vessels. And so those are the three main factors that increase your cholesterol. And so then I asked my brother Joe, I said, which one of those do you think is causing your high cholesterol? He immediately knew. He said, it's probably the way we eat. We eat out all the time and we don't eat really all that healthy. And so I told him, I said, here's what you need to do then. You need to completely turn around your diet and you need to do it quickly. And then within 6 months, you'll have lower cholesterol. Of course, he wanted it done right away, right? Cholesterol lowering medications can do it much quicker. But I told him, listen, it took years, if not longer, for your cholesterol to slowly start creeping up. So it's going to take a while to come down, but give it 6 months. So he did. 6 months of really clean eating, fruits, vegetables, beans, nuts, seeds. And then he has his blood work redone. The cholesterol comes back at 190. His cholesterol dropped 80 points in 6 months because of the way he ate. And the reason I tell you this story is because the food that we're putting in our body is either going to be used for cellular repair, cellular reproduction, the production of energy, or it's going to be toxic. And so when we put healthy food into our body, we can expect it to run like a healthy machine. But if we're putting poor quality food into our body, we're eventually going to be in trouble. And so in tonight's workshop, I'm going to be covering what I consider the three concepts that are around nutrition. And the first concept is we need to move from toxicity to purity. And here's what I mean by that. The foods that we eat, again, can be toxic to our body. And if they are, we're going to develop these health problems. So how do we move from toxicity to purity? We're going to go over that tonight. Then we're going to talk about moving from deficiency to sufficiency. And what I mean by this is that we also need to make sure that there are nutrient-dense foods and that we're getting 100% of the vitamins, minerals, and nutrients that our body needs to operate at 100%. Because if we're getting poor quality of food that's not very nutrient-dense, we're going to end up with a health problem. And then we're going to finish tonight by going over the process of having a clear nervous system. And of course, this is the chiropractic component of tonight's workshop. But we need to realize that our nervous system, and specifically our brain, is controlling and coordinating every function of our body. including the digestive process. And so we're going to take a closer look at that tonight. So let's start out by looking at how we move from toxicity to purity. And the first thing we need to do is we need to look at the foods that we're putting into our body. Are we eating processed foods, foods that have additives and preservatives, or are we eating foods that are refined foods or whole foods? And so what's the difference between the three? And many of you probably already know this, but I don't want to gloss over the basic steps and then have somebody miss this concept. So a whole food is a fresh, natural food, as close to its natural state as possible. So an example of a whole food would be fruits, vegetables, beans, nuts, seeds, and clean meats. So this orange is a whole food. Now, whole foods have all of the vitamins, minerals, and nutrients that your body needs that's present in this food. Now, a refined food starts out as a whole food, but what they've done is they've broken down that whole food into its component parts. And then they've only used a portion of that food to make their product. So in the example of orange, it would be orange juice, right? Not that orange juice is necessarily that bad for you, although I find it very high in sugar, but it doesn't have all the vitamins, minerals, and nutrients that you'd get in an orange. And it's removed most of the fiber, and fiber is really important to reduce your risk of colon cancer and other cancers as well. So that is a refined food. And then the next would be a processed food. And processed foods, again, starts out as a whole food, broken down to its component parts. Just a portion of that is going to be used for the product, but now you have the additives and preservatives. So staying along the theme of an orange, here we have cranberry orange scones. So now cranberry orange scones sounds like it might be healthy. But if you read the ingredients, there's almost 20 ingredients in this product. Most of them you can't even pronounce. So the more processed foods you have, the more toxic you're going to be. Refined foods, we want to minimize those, and we want to stay with mostly whole foods. Now, there's another way that we can get toxic chemicals into our body through the food that we eat. And that's through pesticides. So we want to make sure that we're getting as much organic food as possible. And organic food, obviously, is going to have no pesticides or very little natural pesticides, and it's going to be much, much cleaner. Now, the reason that's so important that we stay away from these processed foods, though, is because the manufacturers, they're masters of deception when it comes to marketing. They literally are masters of marketing. And so you're going to see all kinds of things on their labels. You're going to see fat-free, sugar-free, non-GMO, immune supportive, healthy hearts, 100% natural. But as you dig into their products, you're going to realize they are not as healthy as you think they are. So for example, in your lower left, you're going to see Country Kitchen split top wheat bread. Sounds healthy. It's wheat bread, right? But in order for them to put wheat on the packaging, it only needs to be 10% whole wheat. It can be up to 90% refined, processed, heavily whitened, bleached flour. But as long as it has 10% whole wheat flour, they can put wheat on the label. So unless it says 100% whole wheat, it's not healthy. Nature Valley granola bars. I love this one. And it even sounds healthy, right? You think about it. Nature Valley comes from nature, grown in a valley. It's got to be healthy for you, right? But if you look at the ingredients of Nature Valley granola bars, they hide all the sugar that they put into it. So the second ingredient is sugar. Then there's canola oil, very low quality oil. The fifth ingredient is honey. Now, honey's good for you, but it is a form of sugar. And then the seventh ingredient is also brown sugar syrup. So in that product, there's 3 different forms of sugar with the goal of breaking it up so it doesn't seem like there's as much. So even though there's healthier items in it, it's not a health food for you. So I love what Dr. Joel Fuhrman says about labels. And Dr. Joel Fuhrman's a medical doctor who's written about a dozen books now. You can see 6 of them on your screen, but he's written about a dozen books on how to lower your cholesterol, how to beat diabetes, how to live healthy, how to disease-proof your child, you name it. And this is what Dr. Joel Fuhrman says about reading labels. The most important thing to remember about food labels is to avoid foods that have labels. That's the most important thing that you can do. Now, there's another author out there by the name of Michael Pollan. Michael Pollan writes a book called Food Rules. It's a really small book, very thin, easy to read, take you probably an hour to 2 hours to read this book. But what I love about this book is that it's 64 rules around eating. And so what he does is he lists the rule and then he gives you a 1-paragraph description. So what he says in this book is eat food, not too much, mostly plants. Now, so I'm going to read you rule number 1, eat food. This is what he means by eat food. He says, these days, this is easier said than done, especially when 17,000 new products show up on the supermarket each year, all vying for your food dollar. But most of these items don't deserve to be called food. I call them edible food-like substances. They're highly processed concoctions designed by food scientists, consisting mostly of ingredients derived by corn and soy. And then he goes on to say, today, much of the challenge of eating well comes down to choosing real food and avoiding these industrial novelties. I love what he says there. Basically, if you're going to eat food, eat real food, whole foods. Again, fruits, vegetables, beans, nuts, seeds, and clean meats. That's what we want to eat. If we're going to move from toxicity to purity, we have to make sure that we have healthy, whole foods in our diet. Oh, hold on one second. I clicked something I'm not supposed to click. There we go. Now, oh, there we go. I also recommend eating organic food. So again, we want to make sure that we're getting all the pesticides and herbicides out of our body. And the reason I think it's so important is it's not just for our own personal health, but it's polluting the environment. We know that the pesticides stay in the soil. We know that it gets into the groundwater. And there's what we call evergreen pesticides. They literally will last forever. But the number one complaint about eating whole foods that are organic is the cost. And so when it comes to cost, if cost is an inhibiting factor for you getting organic food, there are certain foods that are more important than others to make sure that you're buying organically. And this comes from the Environmental Working Group. This is from 2018, but they put out the list every year. Environmental Working Group has a list that they call the Dirty Dozen and the Clean 15. And so what you want to do is you want to make sure that if you're getting organic fruits and vegetables, but you're limiting which ones, the Dirty Dozen has more pesticides on it and that get into it that end up getting transferred to you. So things like strawberries and spinach, apples, nectarines, grapes, peaches. So you want to make sure that if you're going to just buy some fruits and vegetables organic, go with the Dirty Dozen. And then the ones that are on the Clean 15 list, they typically have the thicker skin as a general rule, so the pesticides don't penetrate as much. But there is one exception to that rule, and this is bananas. Now, bananas aren't on either list. I find that fascinating because on some lists, I've seen them on the Clean 15, but bananas should not be on the Clean 15. And the reason for that is because when they grow bananas, they put this blue bag around the bananas, and then they spray the inside of it. So the concentration of pesticides on bananas is 10 times greater than most crops. And it's really bad for the environment for the people that are working in those areas. Now, bananas, again, they cost a little bit more, but that it's not significantly more. If you were to go to the grocery store and buy conventional bananas right now, you would spend about 49 cents a pound. So if you really like bananas, you're going to eat between 2 and 3 pounds a week. That's at least a banana a day. So 2 to 3 pounds of bananas is going to cost you about 50 cents more per week. So if you only do one thing from this workshop, eat organic bananas and a couple other organic items. So now we need to talk about moving from deficiency to sufficiency. Again, our body requires 100% of the vitamins, minerals, and nutrients to run at 100%. If you're deficient in anything, your body's going to slowly move away from that high performance machine, and you're going to start to develop problems. But how do you know if you're deficient? Well, one of the easiest ways is, do you have a diagnosed condition? And so what I mean by that is, are you taking medication for anything, right? So one thing that you could be deficient in is iron and vitamin B12. So, and that can lead to anemia. So if you've been told that you have anemia, you're probably deficient in iron or B12. You could also have high cholesterol. So going back to my brother's story, right? He had high cholesterol. Well, we know there's a lot of factors that play a role in high cholesterol, but if it's from a deficiency, it's probably your omega-3 essential fatty acids. But what about osteoporosis? Now, if you're deficient in osteoporosis, what do you think that you're going to be deficient in? And if you can enter that in the chat box, go ahead and enter that in the chat box. Take a guess. What would you be deficient in if you're developing osteoporosis? I bet a lot of people said calcium. And calcium is one of the most common minerals that's in bone, but it's only one of 20 minerals that we find in bone. So if we're taking calcium to increase our bone density, we're actually missing 19 other minerals. But here's the other thing I want you to know about calcium. When it comes to supplementing calcium, calcium has never been shown to increase bone density. Calcium supplements have never been shown to increase bone density. But taking calcium supplements for long periods of time has shown to increase your risk of heart attack. And the reason for that is because calcium helps sustain muscle contraction. So you increase your calcium thinking you're increasing your bone density. It's not, but it is increasing your risk of heart attack. Very concerning to me. Now, there's other factors that play a role into whether or not that calcium is going to get into your bones as well, though. So I want to go through the cofactors that are necessary, and then I'm going to tell you where to get the better sources of calcium. So the first is that you have to have strong stomach acid. Now, when we look at the chart that's on your right, that chart says pH of 1, that's battery acid. Then right below that is your stomach acid. That's a pH of 2. Your stomach acid needs to be between a pH of 2 and a pH of 3 if you're going to break down your food appropriately to be able to break down and get that calcium that's in an absorbable form. Which makes me laugh when somebody tells me that, oh, I get my calcium because I take Tums. While Tums has calcium, it's a really poor form of calcium. But if I were to ask you, what is Tums? What would you say? It's an antacid. So you're literally raising the pH of your stomach acid. Your body can't break down the food and you can't get the calcium absorbed anyhow. So number one thing that you need is that you need a strong stomach acid to break down your food to get the calcium out. Now, once your food is broken down in your stomach, it's going to be moving into your small intestines. In your small intestines, those vitamins, minerals, and nutrients that, let's say, there were once an orange or an apple or some type of other vegetable, now it's broken down into its vitamins, minerals, and nutrients, but now it has to cross from the small intestines into the bloodstream. So you need vitamin D3 to transport the calcium into your blood, which is why most calcium supplements have added D3 to it. But again, you're not getting it all the way to your bone yet because there's a couple more factors that are still missing. The next one, it's your omega-3 essential fatty acids. Omega-3 essential fatty acids help take it from the bloodstream across the blood vessel walls and into the tissues so that your body can use that calcium and all the other nutrients that it's getting. And then finally, we need vitamin K. Vitamin K is what helps transport calcium into the bones. So we need to have strong stomach acid, vitamin D3, omega-3s, and vitamin K. So where are you going to get that? Dark green leafy vegetables and fish that's high in fat. In other words, salmon is one of your best sources. All right, so salmon and dark green leafy vegetables, and you're going to get all that. Your stomach acid will be maintained, your vitamin D will be there, your omega-3 essential fatty acids, and your vitamin K. And now the last step is weight-bearing exercises. If you want to get that calcium into your bones, you have to move and you have to put pressure against the bone. So that way the brain knows we need to deposit more calcium and the other 19 minerals into the bone to keep it strong. That's the way that you take care of osteoporosis, not just by supplementing calcium. Now, the second way you know whether or not you're deficient in calcium, hold on, is you look for signs and symptoms. And so your body is really smart. I talk about this all the time in the office. Your body is super smart and it does things for a reason, but it also can give you warning signs that can tell you what you're deficient in. And so if let's say that you have poor night vision or you have bleeding gums, you might be low in vitamin C or folic acid. If you have spoon-shaped nails, it's B12 or iron. If you have red stretch marks, it's zinc. So there's a lot of different ways you can tell. And you don't have to write these down and remember these, because we have printed this out for you, and it's going to be on the table in the workshop room as you exit the office. So don't worry about remembering all this or writing it down. This is already sitting on the table for you for your next visit. But your body gives you all these warning signs that you're low or deficient in something. And if we recognize what it indicates, then we can address that through our food and sometimes supplements. And then the last way you're going to tell if you're deficient is your blood work. So again, my brother knew that something was going on through his blood work. Your blood work will give you indications of whether or not you have any deficiencies. But it can't be just your standard CBC. You have to ask for a full panel of all the micronutrients, nutrients, everything. And so what you want to do is you want to make sure that you're getting the blood work that covers everything, but you also want to make sure that you're asking for a vitamin D test, because that is a separate test. The insurance companies don't like to pay for it. So if you don't ask for it specifically, your doctor's not going to put it on there. And even when your doctor puts it on there, they have to have the right diagnosis codes for it to be covered. Now, you can pay for one out of pocket as well. They're not all that expensive, but I highly recommend that you get a vitamin D test, because if there's two things that people are deficient in, most commonly, it is the omega-3 essential fatty acids and the vitamin D. Now, why is vitamin D so important? Well, 40 to 80% of Americans are deficient in vitamin D. You say, well, that's a huge range. Why is it such a big range, 40 to 80%? Well, there's a few factors. Number one is your skin color. The darker your skin, the harder it is for those UVB rays to penetrate so that it can so that your body can produce that vitamin D. So that's one factor, is your skin color. The second factor is where you live, right? How much sun can we get? So they say that above or below the 35th parallel, we are not going to produce enough vitamin D 4 to 5 months out of the year. And again, if you think about it, that's because we don't get enough sun. So unless you're this guy, you're probably going to be vitamin D deficient all winter long. So we need to make sure that we get enough sun. But again, there's a difference between sunburn and getting some sun, right? So we want 20, 30 minutes of sun, and we need to be able to have, shorts on and shirts, t-shirts on to get that vitamin D. And then the next thing we need to realize, and the reason that vitamin D is so important, especially at this time in history, is that vitamin D deficiencies are immune suppressant. So what that means is if you're low on vitamin D, you're more susceptible to colds and flus, and especially what's going on right now. And the research that's been coming out over the past year and a half is astonishing. Almost 80% of those that ended up in the ICU and 80% of those that passed away from COVID-19 were vitamin D deficient. And if you read this research right here, which came out in September 2020, at the bottom paragraph, our data gives strong observational support to previous suggestions. And what they mean, previous suggestions, they've tracked this now for well over a year by the time they got to September 2020. And those that were vitamin D deficient were more likely to catch colds and flus. And again, since March, April, much more likely to not only get more significant symptoms from COVID, end up in the ICU, or die from COVID-19. So it's incredibly, incredibly important that we have our vitamin D levels up all year long. So one of the things that I do recommend is that we supplement vitamin D, and again, specifically vitamin D3 throughout the winter time to make sure that we are getting enough. What's interesting is that, when you look at all of the recommendations that are coming out of the federal government, all of the recommendations are around social distancing, masks, and vaccinations. And regardless of what your thoughts are on those, one of the things that Dr. Fauci said in an interview in November, so just after this article came out, Dr. Fauci's on TV, he's given an interview, and they asked him about vitamin D. And he said that he's been taking 8,000 to 9,000 international units of vitamin D since last March. Now, I don't know about you, but I've never heard him say the general public should do that. I think it's critical that we do that. And yet he's talking about all the medical approaches and not the natural approaches, but he's doing it himself. We need more vitamin D in our diet, whether we get it through our food or we supplement. So now let's finish up with the nervous system's control of the digestive process. And again, we need to realize that the nervous system controls and coordinates every function of our body. And specifically, it's our brain. And our brain is controlling all of our other systems. It's controlling our cardiovascular system, our endocrine system, our reproductive system, musculoskeletal system, and our digestive system. And so I want you to think about this for a second. You first get hungry, and it's the center of your brain that starts to trigger your brain to tell you it's time to eat. You see food or you smell food. So it's the optic nerve and it's the olfactory nerve that sends messages to your brain, and your brain says that smells good or that looks good, and it sends a message to your salivary glands to release saliva. That prepares your mouth and your digestive process for that food. Now, you take a bite of that orange, that apple, that broccoli, that spinach, and as your mouth is chewing it, it's your brain that's telling those muscles to move. That food moves into your esophagus. There's a rhythmic contraction that moves this food from the esophagus down in the stomach. That rhythmic contraction is controlled by your brain. Food enters your stomach. The brain recognizes that there's food there, and it tells the lining of the stomach, the cells that line the stomach, to release more stomach acid to break down that food. The food goes into the small intestines, and now the brain tells the pancreas to release amylase, lipase, protease, and insulin to further break down that food and regulate your blood sugar levels. Your body then takes all those vitamins, minerals, and nutrients that, again, was once an orange, and it transfers it into the bloodstream, which then goes into the tissues so that your body can use it for what? Cellular repair, cellular energy, or reproduction. And that's what it needs to use that food for. Again, if it's toxic, it's going to store it into the fat, or it's going to try and figure out how to eliminate it. But if you walk through that process, every bit of it, all the way until the food enters into the small intestines, through the large intestines, and you go to the bathroom, every single step of that process is controlled by your brain, sending messages across your nervous system to tell everything how to work. Now, there's a book out there, so medical textbook called the Guyton's Textbook of Medical Physiology. And Guyton in this textbook writes, strong stimulation or irritation of the sympathetic nervous system can totally block movement of food through the gastrointestinal tract. These nerves originate in the spinal cord between the T8 and L2 levels. So think about that. From your mid-back all the way down to your lower back, those are the nerves that are going to control the lower GI system. And so if you don't move food through appropriately, it's a good possibility that it's irritation to those nerves. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. If you know the answer, you can type it in the chat box. But if you're a patient in this office and don't get this right, we have done something wrong. So what is the number one cause of nerve interference or nerve irritation off of your spine? What do you think it is? Type it in there if you know the answer. What is the number one cause of nerve interference? It is subluxation, right? I hope you guys all got that right. Subluxations interfere with the nervous system. So when your spine misaligns, it irritates or interferes with the nerves. And if you interfere with the nervous system to your GI tract, again, you can totally block the food moving through there. What do we call that? Constipation, right? Now, if that food sits in there long enough and you don't move food through on a regular basis, that constipation turns into irritable bowel syndrome. And that irritable bowel syndrome can be even ultimately turn into colitis. So if you want to have the most from your food, if you want to break it down appropriately, if you want to absorb it appropriately, and if you want to eliminate it appropriately, you have to have a properly functioning spine and nervous system. And that's the chiropractic component of the digestive process and making sure that you're getting the most from your food. So let's do a little review. So we want to move from toxicity to purity. How do we do that? We eat more clean foods, right? Now, bonus on that, sweat. Sweating removes up to 30% of the body's toxins. The second thing you want to do is you want to move from deficiency to sufficiency. How do you do that? You eat more clean foods. Are you starting to get a theme here? So what's number one? Toxicity to purity, eat more clean foods. What's number 2? Deficiency to sufficiency, eat more clean foods. And then supplement when needed. And I say supplement when needed because I want to get all the nutrition from my food if possible. And actually the definition of a supplement is to complete. Supplement is not in place of a good diet, it's to complete a good diet. And in number 3, make sure that your nervous system is clear by getting adjusted. And again, eat more clean food. So now, here's the thing. If you watch this workshop and you say, hey, that was great information, but you don't change anything, you've lost an opportunity to change your health. So as you look at this, do you need to move from toxicity to purity? Do you need to move from deficiency to sufficiency? You're already getting adjusted.